A billionaire in a wheelchair laughed at a starving boy who said he could heal him. But when the boy touched his knee, the impossible happened. What came next will shatter your heart and restore your faith in humanity. If this story moved something in you, hit subscribe. We bring you stories that don't just entertain, they heal, inspire, and stay with you forever. The city bustled like always, money flowing through its veins and power sitting high in towers of glass, but none of that mattered to Thomas Weller anymore. Once hailed as the king of tech investments, Thomas now found himself rolling through the park in a state-of-the-art wheelchair, more prison than privilege. His legs hadn't worked in over 3 years since the accident that stole his mobility and perhaps something deeper, his humanity. Each morning, clad in designer suits and burdened by silent fury, he wheeled himself beneath the old oak trees to sit alone with his bitterness. His Rolex ticked as if mocking the hours he wasted, and his gold cufflinks gleamed with the irony of a man who had everything except what he truly needed. And then he saw the boy. Small, dusty, barefoot, no older than 7, standing still with arms crossed and eyes locked directly on him. At first, Thomas ignored him. Then, irritated, he sneered, "What? You staring at me for, kid?" No reply. Just those eyes, calm, steady, unwavering. Thomas snapped louder, "Soup kitchens downtown." The boy finally stepped forward, slow and quiet, as if each step had weight. "You're angry because no one can fix you," he said. "But I can. If you feed me first." That sentence shattered the air between them. Thomas laughed, loud and sharp, echoing across the path, drawing glances from passing joggers. "Oh, you can heal me?" he mocked, grinning with disbelief. "What are you, some kind of miracle child?" The boy nodded slightly. "If you feed me, I'll heal you." Thomas leaned back, slapped his chest dramatically like he was on stage. "Tell you what, I'll give you $1 million. That's right, 1 million. Heal me now, let's see your little magic trick." But the boy didn't blink. He simply stood there, firm and silent, untouched by the sarcasm, as if he'd heard it all before. Thomas stared, expecting the kid to run or cry or laugh back. But nothing. Just that calm certainty. And in that moment, under the shade of the trees and the eyes of the world, something invisible shifted, something Thomas didn't recognize yet. Something real. Something impossible. Thomas stared at the boy, confused by his calm. Children usually begged, cried, or ran when mocked by someone like him, but this one didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even frown. His eyes held something strange, certainty without arrogance, calm without fear. Thomas felt something twitch inside him, something long buried beneath pride and pain, but he smothered it instantly. "You're serious," he said, his tone shifting from amusement to irritation. "You actually believe you can fix me?" The boy gave a small nod. "If you feed me." Thomas scoffed. "So this is a scam," he muttered. "Fine. You want food? I'll play along." He reached into the side compartment of his wheelchair, pulled out a protein bar, expensive, handcrafted, organic nonsense, and tossed it toward the boy's feet. "There. Eat. Now show me the miracle." The boy bent down, picked up the bar gently, unwrapped it, and took a single bite, chewing slowly. Thomas watched him, a strange unease crawling up his spine. The boy wasn't desperate. He wasn't trying to impress or manipulate. He ate like it was the first real food he'd had in days but still maintained the dignity of someone who knew his worth. "What's your name?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Micah," the boy replied. "Well, Micah," Thomas said, his voice laced with sarcasm, "you've eaten. Now work your magic. I've got board meetings to miss." Micah walked forward until he stood directly beside the wheelchair. Thomas could see the worn seams in the boy's pants, the dirt under his nails, the faint mark of a scar on his left cheek. But what struck him more was how close he felt to something he couldn't explain. Micah reached into the small gray pouch tied to his waist. Thomas watched closely, expecting maybe a trick device or some dramatic prop. But Micah pulled out nothing. Just opened his hand, empty, and held it out to Thomas, palm up. "What is this?" Thomas asked, irritated again. "Faith," Micah replied simply. "Invisible, but real." Thomas snorted. "Oh, we're doing the faith thing now? Let me guess, you don't need me to believe in you. Just in something." Micah looked him in the eye and said softly, "No. I just need you to believe there's still something good left, even in you." And for the first time in years, Thomas Weller had no idea what to say. Thomas gripped the arms of his wheelchair, struggling between laughter and disbelief. This boy, Micah, stood there with his empty hand extended like it meant something. Like it held power. Like it mattered. He wanted to scoff again, to wave him off with another insult, but something about the boy's presence was beginning to dig beneath his skin. You think all it takes is believing there's good in me? Thomas said bitterly. Kid, I've paid for hospitals, funded tech labs, even donated to causes I don't care about just to look decent. Didn't change a damn thing. Micah didn't flinch. That's because you gave with your wallet, not your heart. You wanted applause, not healing. Thomas sneered, don't pretend you know me. Micah tilted his head slightly. But I do. You're the man who fired his assistant while his son lay dying in a hospital. The man who backed out on a friend, left him bankrupt. The man who told his wife to leave because grief made her weak. You don't just carry pain, Thomas, you caused it. Thomas's heart thudded. His smirk faltered. Who told you that? He asked quietly, suddenly breathless. No one, Micah replied. But it's written on you. In the silence around you. In the way you hide behind money and anger like they're armor. The words stung like open air on a wound. Thomas looked away, jaw clenched, heart pounding. So what now? He asked, voice hoarse. You judge me? Or fix me? Micah stepped forward, and without another word, placed his tiny, dust-covered hand on Thomas's knee. And everything stopped. The breeze, the noise, the world. Thomas's breath caught as a strange sensation rose from deep inside his leg. A warmth. A flicker. A tingle. Something that hadn't existed for 3 long years. At first, he thought it was in his head, a ghost feeling. But then it grew stronger. It traveled from his knee up his thigh like a pulse of light. His fingers trembled. His throat tightened. What did you do? He whispered. Micah looked up at him, eyes clear and steady. It's not me, he said. It's him. Thomas blinked rapidly, struggling to process the sensation. Him? He echoed. The one you stopped believing in, Micah said. The one who never stopped believing in you. Thomas stared down at his knee, unable to speak, unable to move, afraid that if he looked away or questioned too much the feeling would vanish. His hand hovered just above the spot where Micah had touched him, the same place that had felt like stone for over 1,000 days. Now it pulsed with something foreign, something warm, something real. He blinked hard, thinking it must be a hallucination, a phantom sensation, but the more he sat still, the more undeniable it became. There was movement. There was life. He looked up at the boy again, something raw creeping into his voice. This isn't possible. I've had surgeons, stem cell trials, experimental tech. Nothing worked. How is this happening? Micah said nothing. He just stood there, arms crossed again, waiting like the silence itself belonged to him. Thomas shook his head, trying to dismiss the fear swelling in his chest. This is a trick. There's no way. Maybe the nerves are coming back on their own. Maybe it's just coincidence. But even as he tried to convince himself, he felt the pressure rising inside him, more than just shock. It was guilt, shame, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. Why me? Thomas asked suddenly. Why would anyone, anything, give me a second chance? Micah stepped a little closer. Because someone needs you to know it was never your legs that were broken, it was your heart. The words hit like thunder in a quiet room. Thomas's face twisted, half in anger, half in grief. You don't know what it's like to lose everything, he snapped. Micah shook his head. You didn't lose everything. You're still alive. That sentence, delivered so simply, pierced through Thomas more than anything he had heard since the day of the crash. He looked away, his jaw trembling, eyes glassy. I was the best, he whispered, like confessing to a ghost. Built empires, destroyed competitors, everyone wanted to be me, until I couldn't walk. Micah remained silent. No comfort, no sympathy, just presence. Thomas looked back at him. I don't understand what's happening. Micah finally spoke again, softly. You asked for healing. But healing only comes to those who truly want to be whole. Not just walk. The billionaire fell silent again, as the breeze rustled around them. And for the first time, his silence wasn't angry, it was searching. Thomas sat in the wheelchair, hands gripping the wheels as if trying to ground himself. The strange pulse in his leg hadn't faded, and with every passing second, it grew stronger, steadier, undeniable. The disbelief was being slowly crushed beneath something far heavier, recognition. The kind that stripped away the false armor built from years of pride. He looked up at Micah, no longer with disdain, but with the eyes of a man realizing he might not know everything after all. You said I didn't lose everything, he muttered. Then why does it feel like I did? Micah replied without pause. Because you measured your life by what you could control. Now that control is gone, and all that's left is who you really are. Thomas laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Who I am? I was a shark in boardrooms, a lion in deals. I didn't apologize. I conquered. I won. You destroyed, Micah said. And when the world stopped applauding, you thought you'd been robbed. But it wasn't the world, it was you. You robbed yourself. The word stung like cold wind. Thomas looked down at his hands, the same hands that once signed contracts worth billions, that once pushed competitors to ruin. But now they trembled, not from weakness, but from memory. My assistant, Jordan, he whispered. His son needed surgery. I said I couldn't wait and fired him on the spot. Micah stayed quiet. My friend Marcus. I pulled out of a partnership and left him bankrupt. And my wife. God, she cried every day for months after her sister died. I told her grief was weakness. I told her to leave. The last words came out like poison he'd finally forced from his chest. I told her to leave because her pain made me uncomfortable. His voice cracked, and he pressed his palms into his face, trying to hide the tremor. Why are you here, Micah? Who sent you? Micah looked up at the sky as if waiting for an answer only silence could give. Then he said, sometimes, people are sent not to punish you, but to remind you that there's still time. Thomas lowered his hands, eyes burning. Time for what? Micah looked directly at him. To become someone different. Someone better. Not for applause. Not for redemption. Just because it's right. And in that moment, Thomas felt something begin to break, not his body, but the walls around his soul. Thomas remained motionless, not out of paralysis but from the weight of something far heavier than flesh, truth. His whole life had been about movement, about momentum, about crushing obstacles and getting ahead. But now, for the first time, he was forced to be still in a way that demanded he face what he had been running from all along. Micah stood before him without judgment, without urgency, as if he knew that this silence was part of the healing itself. You said I wanted control, Thomas finally whispered. You were right. I bought everything I couldn't feel. Attention, fear, respect. I never knew how to earn love, so I never tried. Micah said nothing, only nodded slightly as if to say he already knew. Thomas looked down at his legs again, still feeling the strange sensation, alive, electric, foreign. Do you know what it's like to be helpless? He asked. To have people look at you and see pity instead of power? Micah replied, do you know what it's like to be hungry for 3 days? To watch your mother die on a cold floor no one ever swept? To give your only pair of shoes away to someone who needed them more? The words landed like stones dropped in water, quiet, but rippling deep. Thomas clenched his jaw, blinking back tears. I thought money made me safe, he said. I thought if I had enough of it, nothing could hurt me. But it made you numb, Micah answered. And now, for the first time, you're starting to feel. That sentence pierced something buried, and Thomas couldn't stop the tear that slipped down his cheek. He quickly wiped it away, but Micah saw it, and more importantly, he didn't say a word. There was no shame in the boy's eyes, only the kind of quiet understanding that stripped away all defenses. I offered you $1 million, Thomas said softly. And you didn't even blink. Micah replied, because I never wanted your money. Someone else needs it. I needed you to remember who you were before money told you who to be. Thomas swallowed hard. And who is that? Micah stepped forward. Someone who can stand again, not just on legs, but on mercy. Thomas's breath caught, not because he was afraid, but because part of him dared to believe the boy was right. That maybe standing again meant far more than walking. The sun filtered through the oak branches above, casting broken shadows across the path where Thomas sat in silence. Around him, life moved on. Joggers passed, birds chirped, the world paid no attention to the billionaire breaking in plain sight. He stared down at his legs, eyes locked on the same limbs that had betrayed him for over 3 years. But now they tingled, not like pins and needles or fleeting nerves, but like fire slowly thawing frozen flesh. Micah stood beside him, no longer needing to say anything. His presence was louder than any words. Thomas gripped the armrests of the wheelchair so tightly his knuckles turned pale. What if I fall? He asked quietly, the pride in his voice eroded into pure vulnerability. Then fall, Micah replied calmly. And get up again. It was a strange moment. For a man who had built empires, who had commanded rooms full of the powerful and wealthy, standing up should have been simple. But now, it was the greatest mountain he had ever faced. Slowly, He placed his feet flat on the ground. They didn't feel hollow. They felt real. Firm. Like they were ready. He inhaled deeply, every breath fighting the voice inside that said this wasn't possible. He tightened his grip, pushed down on the footrests, and rose. It wasn't dramatic. There was no choir of music, no applause, no sudden crowd gathering to witness a miracle. Just a man who hadn't stood in over 1,000 days finding the strength to try again. He stood. Shakily. Uncertainly. But he stood. His legs trembled beneath him like newborn branches bending under weight, but they held. Thomas's eyes widened, breath catching in his throat as he looked at Micah. The boy didn't smile, didn't cheer. He simply nodded, like he'd been waiting for this moment the whole time. "You did it," Thomas whispered. "No," Micah said gently. "You finally believed you could." Thomas looked up at the sky, the same sky he'd cursed so many mornings from this exact bench. But now it looked different. Not because it had changed, but because he had. "Why me?" he asked. "Because the ones who are hardest to heal," Micah said, "are the ones who have the most to give once they are whole." And with that, the boy turned and began to walk away down the path, one small step at a time. Thomas stood rooted in place, not just physically but emotionally, suspended between the man he had been and the man he was just beginning to discover. His knees trembled beneath the unfamiliar weight, but the sensation was addictive, painful, alive, and undeniably real. He watched as Micah's small figure walked slowly down the path, his feet making soft imprints on the gravel that felt more eternal than any million-dollar deal Thomas had ever signed. "Wait," Thomas called out, voice cracking, desperate not from fear but from the overwhelming need to not let this moment slip away. Micah stopped, turned halfway, his eyes steady. Thomas took a shaky step forward, then another, every nerve screaming but obeying. He reached the boy and dropped to one knee, not from weakness, but from something deeper, reverence. "I have money, cars, houses, everything you could ever want," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Please, take something. Let me do something for you." Micah tilted his head slightly. "I told you, I don't need your money." "But someone does," Thomas added quickly. "Let me give it to them. Let me give it to anyone. Just tell me what to do." Micah stepped forward, and for the first time, placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder, not to heal, but to guide. "Then feed someone who's hungry. Forgive someone you hurt. Give, not because it lets you sleep better, but because it lets someone else wake up with hope." Thomas nodded, the words branding themselves into his heart. "You saved me," he whispered. Micah shook his head slowly. "I reminded you. Saving yourself was something you always could do, you just forgot how." The simplicity of that truth cut deeper than all the therapy Thomas had wasted money on. He looked around the park, suddenly seeing things he hadn't noticed before: the man asleep on a bench, the girl with bruises on her arms, the old woman picking crumbs for birds. Lives invisible to him yesterday now blazed in color. He turned back to Micah, but the boy had already begun walking again, disappearing into the tree-lined trail without farewell, without fanfare. No miracle exit. Just quiet retreat. Thomas stood alone, not broken but reborn, the air feeling different around him. He realized this wasn't the end of the story. This was the debt that couldn't be repaid with dollars, only with transformation. And this time, he intended to pay it in full. 1 week later, the man the world once called invincible stood behind a folding table in a plain white apron, sleeves rolled up, serving hot meals to a line of strangers. Cameras flashed in the distance, capturing the moment for morning news and human interest blogs, but Thomas Weller didn't care. He wasn't here for press. He wasn't here to rebrand. He was here because for the first time in his life, he saw people, really saw them. The place was called Micah's Table, a non-profit center funded entirely by Thomas. There were no gold plaques, no rooms named after him, no private offices. Just a kitchen, warm food, and rows of chairs where no one asked what you did or how much you earned, only if you were hungry. He asked every person their name before handing them a plate, not out of routine but out of reverence. Every time he bent forward, he felt the ground beneath his feet, felt the way his legs now held him steady. But what he felt more was the invisible fire inside him that burned with purpose. He had spoken to architects, bought the building, recruited volunteers, and personally handpicked every meal on the menu. But when asked for a statement by the media, he only said, "This isn't about me." His team had begged him to give a speech at the ribbon cutting. He refused. What was there to say that could match what Micah had done with a touch and a truth? The boy had vanished, no one had seen him since that day in the park. No one knew where he came from or where he went. Some reporters assumed Thomas had staged the entire event to repair his image, but he didn't bother correcting them. He didn't need validation anymore. What he needed was to serve. Each plate he handed out felt like a brick removed from the wall he had built around his soul. And each smile from those he fed was a light cracking through the places once sealed by ego. One man, covered in dirt and carrying a shopping cart of all his possessions, took a bowl of soup and said, "Thank you, sir." Thomas nodded and replied, "It's just Thomas. And you're welcome." He looked out at the growing line, not as a problem to fix, but as people to know. And in that line, in every quiet thank you, he found pieces of Micah again, faith, hope, and redemption woven into every bite. Night had fallen, and the last of the meals had been served. The chairs were stacked, the kitchen wiped clean, and the soft hum of the refrigerator echoed in the quiet. Thomas stood alone at the center of Micah's table, apron wrinkled, hands smelling of onions and dish soap, heart full. He looked out across the room, this sacred space that had once been nothing but an idea, now filled with stories, laughter, and warmth. In a corner sat a pair of shoes he'd bought earlier that day for a boy who arrived barefoot. On the wall hung a small drawing someone had left, a childlike sketch of a man standing next to a boy, both smiling under a tree. Written in crooked letters were the words, "Thank you, Micah." Thomas stepped closer, reaching out to touch the paper as if it were the most valuable thing he'd ever owned. No stock certificate, no business deal, no luxury possession had ever meant so much. This wasn't a return to power, it was a rebirth of purpose. He sat down at the nearest bench, exhausted in the best way possible. He rubbed his legs, still amazed they moved on command, still wondering if it was a dream. But they held him. Every step was real. Every sensation proof that something greater had moved through him. Not science. Not medicine. Something deeper. He thought of Micah, the quiet strength in his voice, the calm in his eyes, the truth he carried without fear. Where was he now? Did he know what he'd done? Did it matter? Thomas didn't think so. Micah hadn't come for praise. He came with a message, not that miracles are flashy, but that they begin when we surrender our pride and choose compassion. Thomas pulled out his phone and opened a note titled "To Micah." He wrote, "You changed me. Not by healing my legs, but by showing me who I really was. I hope wherever you are, you're warm, safe, and loved. I owe you my life. I'll repay it one plate, one hand, one heart at a time." He hit save and closed the phone. Outside, the wind was gentle. The city still buzzed with its lights and noise, but inside Micah's table, peace reigned. Thomas stood once more, not as the man who lost everything, but as the man who found what money could never buy, a second chance.